Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Evolving Skies, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we're going to be re-reviewing our Chilling Reign set review. Now, I normally do this before our set review would have been for Evolving Skies, but of course we've already put that out there. So I just thought it would be a nice, fun thing to do to sort of break up the deck list that we've been showing over the last few weeks. To really see how some of these Chilling Reign cards performed. We've pretty much had every meaningful tournament of Chilling Reign so far, I guess you could say. There are still some going on here and there, some online ones, but I think a lot of people are already starting to look towards, you know, the POG format, for example, and even into post-rotation as well. So we're really closing the chapter on Chilling Reign. We've had our Players' Cups 3, 4, and also the 25th Anniversary Invitational, so there's not too much more we can glean from the Chilling Reign set. So let's talk about what we got right, what we got wrong, and also how these cards will be adapting in the post-rotation meta as well. So Agatha is truly a poor card, as is Avery. Still don't play this if you're looking for an Eternatus counter. I still feel like Zapdos is better, and if you're worried about Eternatus for any reason, I think Avery isn't a solution for you. Even if you're playing something like Shadow Rider post-rotation with Alcremie, I don't foresee Avery being a good enough include. Brawly, pretty poor. It did find its way into some of the sort of roguish Malamar Rapid Strike style variants, but I don't think it ever got too powerful. And even then it wasn't guaranteed. Caitlyn, very poor, obvious. Doctor, very poor. Flannery should be a 1-star, I think. We basically gave it the benefit of the doubt as that 2-star option in case there was any control variants doing that well. But Flannery wasn't really the big card that Control needed. Actually, it was Klara that was the biggest change for Control. So Honey, 1-star. Karen's Conviction, we will drop down to 1-star because the single strike, you know, Urshifu deck continued to do poorly, and the one prize decks weren't good enough. You know, their type coverage alone was like their main selling point, the sort of Seviper Stonejourner thing, but it wasn't enough to actually make them valid decks in their own right because they were too clunky in general. Klara, I'll probably go up on the 2-star count, actually, just exactly for Control. I feel like Control is one of these weird ones. We're in online tournaments. You never actually see enough of Control, really. But I do feel like Control is decent in this format. And we saw in some of the Players' Cup games where Hampus was playing Excadrill, Klara was like an all-star card for that deck. So possibly like 2-star for how niche it actually does see play and the fact that Control isn't really high on the leaderboards or anything like that. But, you know, I'll keep it as a 2-star, but just sort of give it the nod that it is a great enabler for Control. And obviously Control, again, gets gutted by rotation, so maybe Klara, again, is homeless for a little while, but this card is super duper powerful, and shout out to Klara for being an epic cube card as well. I think easily the highest priority recovery piece that you can draft in Cube. Melony, I think 4-star is pretty fair. Probably actually all the way up to 5, because Ice Rider has cemented itself as a top 5 deck in the game, and Melony is staple there. I do foresee, potentially even in POG format, there could be some Melony-based, you know, Suicune variants with Altaria. In post-rotation formats, there will continue to be Suicune variants, potentially Aurora Box Suicune, which I'm still yet to profile, but I'm pretty excited by. And Ice Rider isn't going to be going anywhere. I think, you know, the Blastoise and the Inteleon VMAX have been proven to be less consistent, less good than Ice Rider in general, so just stick to that card, I think, for the most part. Peony, we will drop to 1-star. It's not seeing any play, and although there are some like dream cards coming out from Evolving Skies, that won't change how good this card is, I don't think. Peony, wow, okay, so the path to the peak really changed ADP in a direction that we weren't expecting. I was expecting that Peony was going to be the way to really sort of fine-tune the Gus game plan of ADP, and because of fear of Path of the Peak and early renditions of Shadow Rider certainly went down a hand control approach. Then we came to like the middle of the meta of Chilling Reign where there wasn't actually that much path. And then towards the latter stages of the meta, Ice Rider really cemented itself as being one of the strongest path decks. Shadow Rider could play an amount of path just alongside stamps and that sort of thing, alongside their own Marshadows. It basically meant there was never a window where we could just lean into Peony, Engine plus Kricketune for the most part. So this was actually one of the decks that I tested the most in the build up to Chilling Reign, and this is one of the things where it's like it's a deck that I built in my own meta bubble, but didn't respect Path of the Peak to be played widely enough in archetypes. So we ended up going down this direction of ADP and going, higher on Great Catch Account, having that Echoing Horn always in there to be a pick off the discard pile option to then have a Gust for game route. So I still think in a vacuum, if you were to build an AD Peony style deck right now for Chilling Reign, it would actually perform very, very well because there's very few pure path decks, I think. But out of fear of, or like respect for path, I guess you could say, the fact that this list was so crippled by path, you like just lose basically, because you won't be able to play your Peony if, like, outside of going for like a Swell plus a Cherish Ball, and then it's a pointless supporter anyway. It could just be a research. It really took us in a different direction. Now, I still think the supporter has potential, but I think as long as Path's around, and now we only have things like Crobat, and you can only search that through like Quick Ball. Peony was actually often very good at grabbing a card plus Cherish Ball for Dedenne, and that option is taken away from us. So Peony is going to go all the way down to a 1-star. It's very, very close though, because it's so reliant on Path's play that this actually wasn't the best ADP variant. It actually turned into obviously ADP Bird Box, which we ended up seeing do very, very well, and is still easily in like the top 10 decks, where you just have the Galarian birds in there and a lower count of energy. But we could easily have seen just like straightforward ADPization with a high Peony being the best ADP build that played exactly Zation. So this is a really funky one because I was super hyped for this archetype and basically never actually got to play it in tournaments just because of Path to the Peak. So yeah, that's a really strange one, and it's something to bear in mind about my own biases as like a deck builder and my own bias of like not respecting Path enough as a card that I don't play enough in decks. So that's one of those things where you only test against, yourself and your own friends group for the first month or whatever. Then you don't see these hurdles actually coming up. So that's something to bear in mind to sort of bias check ourselves for future ratings of cards. Seabold is a 1-star and is still very poor. Echoing Horn probably isn't the 5-star card we imagined. Obviously, Control didn't really kick off. It would have been a decent card for Control, I still contest, especially if we are playing like a boss Galamine game plan. And that's something to earmark for the future, because I think these are the pieces that sort of remain relevant post-rotation. ADP could play Echoing Horn, oftentimes played 1, but didn't always play 1. And I think the Galarian Bird Boxes were better served without playing this card. So it went into like straight ADPization, but not necessarily a good card in the Bird Box. Urshifu didn't need to play this card in the end, and Victini VMAXs really fell by the wayside quite early on in the format, although they were pretty reasonable at the start of Chilling Reign. As Ice Rider started to take hold, the Victini wasn't great. So yeah, overall Echoing Horn can be dropped to a 3-star as like a maybe possible card in what is a tier 1 deck in ADP variants. But yeah, it's by no means guaranteed, and I think it's actually like not correct to play in a number of these decks. So yeah, Echoing Horn wasn't the be all and end all that people were expecting. Expedition Uniform dropped to a 1-star. Well, yeah, it was a 1-star, obviously. Fog Crystal, yeah, obviously insane card. Was the backbone of Shadow Rider, is the sort of a backbone for some Mewtwo variants out there as well. But yeah, and that's going to simply continue. Pretty much not much to say about the card. It's pretty bonkers still for Shadow Rider. Lantern, we will drop down to the 1-star because I feel like any single strike deck that I'm building right now isn't building around these two supporters as a core. So we'll drop it to 1. If we get better single strike supporters, we need to get some substantially better single strike supporters for this Lantern to actually see play. Because we're still struggling to see any 1-prize archetype work, and it pretty much has to be 1 prizes to make the most out of Bruno in the first place. So yeah, I think for now these are just going to be sort of dead and buried. Chestplate is obviously terrible. Gloves are all terrible. Rugged Helmet, we rated 3 stars. This is an interesting one. So Pikarom really fell out of favor in Chilling Reign for the first time ever, essentially. There's been so many times where we've expected Pikarom to actually finally die, and it wasn't until Chilling Reign format that it actually happened. And I think that was one of the core energy disruption style decks. So seeing that had no home made the Rugged Helmet substantially worse. And essentially just us needing Air Balloon to be in every deck as competition for this item card, and then oftentimes health buff tools were important. Like Eternatus had to play Big Charm to play around Zapdos, that sort of thing. It just meant there wasn't really a place for Rugged Helmet. Again, it's one of those cards that I played a good amount in the pre-Chilling Reign format and found its value here and there. And Inteleon obviously flopped and just sort of paved the way for Ice Rider. So in the end, there just wasn't much of a place for this kind of card. And Energy Disruption in general, just remember that going into Chilling Reign, Crushing Hammer was a 4-off in Pikarom that was like a tier 1/2 deck. So it's one of these cards that looks amazing because we've just come out of a format where Energy Disruption was huge and Yell Grunt was like a 2-off in Pikarom to a point now where like Energy Disruption just isn't a thing whatsoever. The combination of Shadow Rider not caring too much and Ice Rider not caring too much really changed things up. And even like Eternatus got less prone to hammers and that sort of thing. So this is one of those cards that like in a vacuum is still very solid, but just isn't in the right meta, and it looked to be in the right meta because we've just come off a crushing meta. But it's a long-winded way of saying the card does have good impact, just not in the Chilling Reign format. So it's again one of these ones that you might want to keep around for post rotation here and there. I feel like Energy Disruption may be having a small resurgence post row, but I don't think it's that strong compared to the other tool options that we have. So I'll bump it down to the 1-star for now, but it's got that sort of plus mark to it where I could see there being points in formats where it's a useful card for sure. Scroll is terrible. Other Scroll is terrible. Dynatory Hill is terrible, even with no swell in the format post-rotation. Old Cemetery could, in theory, be played in Shadow Rider still, but I do think oftentimes you're best served just with Training Courts going forward. Dragapult decks, if they're going to be a post-rotation thing, I think they need a card like Old Cemetery. So you'd be playing, your Horror Psychics, your Old Cemeteries in high counts, really trying to offset how terrible Max Phantom's damage is. So I think it's a mandatory card there. I think 2-star is actually... I mean, it's too kind to give it 2-star right now. I know some Eternatus lists that I've seen for post-rotation even have tried out this card just to augment damage and you don't really care about putting damage on yourself sort of thing. And that's an interesting avenue. I haven't really tried it to say how good it is. So right now we'll just bump it down to the 1 and again sort of earmark it for future. Cards like these get substantially better now that Swell have gone though. Path is a 5-star card. It did end up seeing play in both Shadow Rider and Ice Rider. Green's decks didn't make a huge resurgence, and things like low maintenance VMAXs like Victini didn't do too well. We're sort of yet to see how good that sort of option is going to be post rotation. Obviously, something that is low maintenance like Victini can still play Path going ahead, where you improve your Shadow Rider matchup, you improve your Rayquaza VMAX matchup, that sort of thing. But it doesn't do much else outside of that. I do think, obviously, coming out of a format where we have had Resetting Hull and Swell, we can start to see the potential, like, in air quotes, full power of Path. But at the same time, I feel like Crobat plus Dedenne plus Eldegoss was like a whole engine in itself that could be copied and pasted into a ton of other decks. And that isn't going to be so much the case post-rotation. I feel like the copy-paste is going to be Inteleon engines, which you don't really care about Path of the Peak so much. So I think outside of Shadow Rider and Ray, this becomes more like a tech card rather than, like matchup tech card, rather than just like you play 4, you jam it turn 1, you see if it crumbs someone over. Maybe that still has it still will be the case when there's just Crobat and stuff in the mix, where I imagine people will be going up to 2 copies of Crobat in a number of decks. But yeah, it's going to have an interesting interaction going forward, and I'm still so terrified that we're playing a lot of these stage 1 decks, even with like Inteleon lines being shoved in. It's just such a high quantity of cards that you're putting into your deck just to make the engine work. I don't feel like there's actually too much space to play like quad path decks. And if you are making those spaces, you're hurting your own consistency by, trimming down that extra incense, trimming down that extra like level ball, trimming down that supporter, going down to 3 boss rather than 4. These sorts of cuts are what you have to do for path, just in the hope that it helps a matchup or that it crumbs someone in the opening turn. So I think the dynamic of path is actually really different to how it is in current format, in the Chilling Reign meta at least. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and I'm actually playing path in, I think, less decks post-rotation than current format. The other thing I will say, though, is depending on the walling archetypes that end up succeeding, if Glaceon and Zamazentization end up being good decks, Path may actually be the savior to the format, in air quotes, because it allows us to wall break. So that is another reason why Path remains a very, very strong 5-star. Its sort of development and its place in the meta shifts, but I still think it's obviously a very good option for a ton of decks. Impact Energy sucks. Let me just go back on this slide to recognize the fact that there will be multiple type attacking single strike decks in the future, where there's the option to play Umbreon plus Urshifu. I still feel like you prefer basic energies just because of laser focus as an option. So yeah, I should have mentioned that. Lucky Energy actually was better than a 1-star because it did feature in the Rogue Blissey decks. So we'll give this a 2-star for being relatively important part of a quad Blissey, which was again rogue and weird and wacky. But now Blissey doesn't have weak guard energy, so it's basically unplayable. Spiral Energy should not be a 3-star. We'll actually go all the way down to 1-star here. Urshifu just preferred having basic energy outs, I think, more often, as we developed away from a Jirachi build. Remember, pre-Chilling Reign, we were all in Jirachi Town with our Urshifu, and we started to work towards the Intel builds. So, yeah, it's interesting development there. As we moved into Inteleon, it meant that we didn't have the sort of spaces to try out the Zeraora Coco sort of synergy combo thing going on. And yeah, we just wanted basic energies so we could search them with like Spinner off of your Intel. So something to bear in mind there. And I think post-rotation, the only real special energies you should be playing is obviously Rapid Strike Energy and Capture probably. And then your remaining slots are likely going to be just basic fightings. So yeah. So there's our trainer summary. Overall, the biggest sort of flop or whatever I would say is Peony. Outside of that, Echoing Horn did substantially worse, and some of these 3-stars that we're giving the benefit of the doubt were kind of like worse in a lot of the instances. So yeah, overall, not too far off the pace. Onto the VMAXs. Celebi was obviously terrible and remains terrible post-rotation. Blaziken's an interesting one. I think 3 is a relatively safe place to put it. It did have some placements here and there, and I feel like it's going to do a similar thing post-rotation where it's likely going to fit into the Sylveon deck as a 1-1 line, just because it really improves Sylveon's matchup against Zacian decks, because you can just Max Blaze through them for 1 Rapid Strike Energy attachment, and that's obviously very good for you. So yeah, I think Blaziken Zeraora was like this lower tier, you know, in air, not really rogue, but it was, yeah, a lower tier standard deck, I would say right now. And if Zacian Inteleon continues to be a very, very, you know, high profile contender in the early stages, Blazaura could even be a decent opening pick in the few weeks of the post-rotation format. But I do foresee it seeing that little bit of 1-1 tech play in Sylveon, maybe even a 2-2 tech line in Sylveon, again, depending on that the amount of play that Zacian decks see, because he is very good at dealing with exactly that card, and that's going to be important post-row. But I don't think you just go all in on Blazaura post-rotation too much, even though Zeraora in theory gets stronger in a vacuum because there's no more Mew or whatever. I think those issues remain, and I think you want to have the extra coverage that a Sylveon build can provide. Volk is very poor. Ice Rider, we can go all the way up to 5-stars. I think it's proven itself, even with its weakness, that it can compete. We've seen a ton of interesting lists where we've had things like Articuno recently adding in to protect your regular Vs in the sort of early game so they don't just get boss KO'd. It can even be an attacking presence where you can do that 70 into a Max Lance the following turn to effectively 2-shot VMAXs, which is really cool. So I really like that addition. I think it was Shintaro played it in some online tournaments. Then we saw in the 25th anniversary invitational, I know Henry Brand was playing it as well. And I've played a good amount of Ice Rider actually in the last like month or so, after playing Shadow Rider for pretty much the first like 3 months, or like the first 2 months of Chilling Reign, I guess you could say. 3 months if you're counting like the pre-Chilling Reign even being released. But Ice Rider's been more of a fascination over the last month for me personally, just to see how it ticks and get a grips with the Inteleon engine in general going into post-rotation. It's obviously a huge deal here. And yeah, Ice Rider sort of split off in 2 directions mostly. The defensive path list that played mostly shady dealing Inteleon and sometimes like 1 quick shooter, or aggressive lines that was playing multiple quick shooters and sometimes even things like Leon in the list. And I think going forward, we could still have that same divide. I think Inteleon has pretty much solidified itself as coming out on top. As the main engine. There is potential to play Suicune Altaria engines now as well, though. So yeah, the future's bright for Ice Rider. I think there's a lot to like here about it. So Ended up being 5-star in the Chilling Reign format, and I think we'll continue to see some relatively high placements for Ice Rider. I know that early on I've been thinking that this is like the next thing since sliced bread in the post-rotation format. But I am seeing a lot of Zacian hype, and that still scares me. So, yeah, something to bear in mind. Zeraora, we should probably dip down from the 4-star. I think we gave it such high praise because there was the potential for it to be part of this Urshifu deck that was just playing Jirachis and whatnot. Because again, at the time, we had only really seen successful Jirachi Urshis. Yes, Cincino Urshifu was piloted by Tord a good amount and did have some popularity behind it. But going into Chilling Reign, Jirachi was still the best way to play Urshi, and that became... that changed as soon as we saw quick shooting paired with rapid strike. So it meant that there wasn't any space for a card like this. And I think it's a potential one-of in the Sylveon deck, but not too much outside of that. Maybe it's a one-of in Rayquaza, but I think it's probably not good enough. So we can drop this probably all the way. Well, it's still an option in so many decks. Maybe it's a 3-star for that purpose, but I think it will see very little play. So like maybe down to a 2-star even. Articuno is bad. Shadow Rider is obviously busted. Don't need to say much here. Draws you a ridiculous amount of cards. Has a lot of options within the deck. Post-rotation, it loses a lot of those options. The tag teams really gave it some flexibility. The Gengar, for that Horror House, either early on or late game to secure game. Just give yourself an extra, 3 Underworld doors is just nuts. Trev Noir with Stamp or with Marnie as a win condition. We saw Alcremie in the list as well, going from 1-1 to 2-2 lines even. And I think 2-2 lines are pretty much where we're going to be staying post-rotation if you are going for a full Psychic build. There will potentially also be an Aurora-based build that is still playing those Zapdos and playing like Necrozma V potentially as well. So those are things to bear in mind. But everyone knew this card was going to be crazy. It draws cards, it attaches extra energies, and that's not going to change post-rotation. Galarian Zapdos is definitely a 5-star. Pretty much identified everything we needed to here. Mewtwo was able to survive with an Aurora package. And Zapdos was a huge upgrade to Sirfetch'd at the time. Shadow Rider had the option to play Galarian Zapdos, and I think early on in the format, at least, a lot of people did do that, and people moved, as Eternatus got scared off by the Urshifus, it meant that Shadow Rider could go away from Zapdos and still play Alcremie and have a decent time in the format. ADP did go towards a bird build with Aurora as well, which I think is cool that we identified so early. So yeah, I think Zapdos is an absolutely outstanding card. I think special energies will be rife post-rotation as well. I'm trying to shoehorn capture into as many decks as possible, and that means that Thunderous Kick, removing attachments and setting up 2 shots is just mental. Really, really good, even if you're not hitting for that weakness or whatever. So that card is crazy, and there's just more V Pokemon around the board because we're not sharing our board space now with GXs. So Zapdos will be online a lot easier, a lot faster potentially. And the discard of special energy isn't just laughing at weak guard anymore. Now it's just going to be good in general. So yeah, really, really strong card going ahead. Sandaconda will drop to 1-star. It's a meme, right? Galarian Moltres. How do we not give this 5 stars? Insane card, ultimately. It actually was good enough to bring Dark Box back to the forefront. And we kind of put this on here just saying, shrug, it's that time to try Dark Box again. But it actually was, it actually brought us to the land of 6 energy attachment, Dark Moon GX, lean back in the chair and crack open a beer type of situation where you're red and bluing into Weavils and Sylvallies and that sort of thing and actually getting things done. Absolutely insane. Moltres is just such ridiculous value. It did carve the way in a new Moltres build, but I think... a new Eternatus build where we did play E-switches to protect around hammers and just get online earlier. It allowed us to use attacks like Assault Gate and whatnot in those opening stages, just to put damage into play to set up VMAXs for Dread End, those sorts of things. Take, early aggressive 1-prize KOs and all of that stuff. So, and even have non-fighting weak dark type Pokemon in your deck for the Shadow Riders that were playing the Zapdos in the first place. Moltres became like a main attacker in that Shadow Rider matchup anyway, just to skew that race, etc. So yeah, Direflame Wings just powering itself up, absolutely absurd. And all of that's without me even mentioning its ADP presence. And it actually was the main reason why ADP moved on from just a pure ADPization was, sometimes we saw 4 straight up Moltres and no Zacian in some of these lists. I personally feel like the best was a split of both, but regardless, the free attachments that you gain from the Moltres throughout you know, the game that you gained was just absolutely insane with the Verbank, what am I saying, not Verbank, Viridian, for those discards and piecing together what should be a silly amount of different energies all in one deck. So yeah, really, really insane card. And I think going forward, it's still one of the best ways to get through Shadow Rider post-rotation. It could end up being an Urshifu tech card, especially now that we are losing Karate Belt. You may want to play Moltres E-Switch in your lists to allow yourself to chain GMAX Rapid Flow whilst also having Dark type coverage. Moltres could also end up continuing to be in Aurora-style box decks even without ADP going forwards, something like a Suicune box, or could end up even alongside like Victini and a few other things if we just accept that Shadow Rider's a scary deck in the format and you just want to improve that matchup. I do think it can be a package deal. Now, what I would say is post-rotation, losing the Viridian is a big problem. It really allowed you to Dire Flame Wings every single turn without fail. And now that package goes from like 2 Moltres, 4 Dark Energy, and like 3 Viridian to like 2 Moltres and like 7 Dark Energy, just so that you can be quick balling, Viridianing, Aurora Energying, that sort of thing consistently. So that's something to bear in mind. You don't get it off as much as you would pre-rotation. But yeah, Moltres was absolutely bonkers. And, you know, outside of Shadow Rider, is probably like the second best card of the set. Like, it's actually just super, super crazy. Liepard was that potential include for Eternatus, but I think ultimately it was mostly a no rather than a yes. I think actually post-rotation it will be more of a yes than a no, surprisingly, because I think there will be more Toughness Capezations. There'll be more, air balloons floating around that you can just get value on here and there. There could potentially be some tool jammers on Leafeons that you might just want to get rid of, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think Liepard will be more of a yes than a no in Eternatus. So we'll drop it down to a 2-star as still that, like, questionable one-of that you sometimes see in Eternatus and you go, oh, that's a wacky card, but I get why it's in there. And I think going forward it will be, that's more off, like, I have to play around Liepard when I can, sort of thing. So, yeah, it's still worth having a one-of, I think, right now in the binder. Slowking is obviously terrible. Metagross is terrible. Blissey is a rightful 3-star, actually. Mostly just a quad deck. All of these other fun options that we had on the side didn't really matter. Just 4 Bliss and just, 4 Capes, 4 Hammers, and like 20 energy was the best way to play it. So yeah, the potential of just having a beefy 2 prize it was genuinely there. And you just had to try and slow the game down with Hammerheads, Path, that sort of thing, so that you can make Blissful Blast strong. Now, what I will say is we're losing, what's it called? Weakness Guard Energy, which is a really, really big deal. We're losing some other like burst acceleration that's on the screen here. So, yeah, I think a quad Blissey deck gets much worse post-rotation. Tornadus was quite bad. Maybe not quite 1-star bad, but yeah, pretty bad in general. Possibly the best way to play Single Strike VMAX in this format, but still quite poor. So yeah, in summary, we were pretty much bang on here for the V and VMAXs. I think, we saw that Moltres and Ice Rider would be good, but they actually tipped themselves to be like even better. So just a small lift there, but pretty much bang on in every other category. Onto the 1 prizes then. Abomasnow's terrible, Beedrill's terrible, Cinderace should have been a 1-star. That was a dreamer play, that's for sure. You could see how much I was sold on Karen, right? I had the Seviper, the Karen herself, the Lantern, and now even the Cinderace, basically in air quotes overrated, because I thought that the payoff of Karen was good enough. And you can see why. I even had a graph here of the damage you could in theory be doing, but it just had to happen on a perfect turn situation, which was hard to do, especially for 1 prizes, where you're always scrambling for other things throughout the entire game. So yeah, 1-star for this guy. Froslass was an unworthy 1-star, I think, because it actually is a valid potential option in Ice Rider. And I think going forward, it may become more of an option, actually, where we may want to start playing Cheryl in our Ice Rider. We may want to start playing, or having the option to chain Max Lance while still having the option to boss, I should say. And now that every Ice Rider is a levelable engine that plays Inteleon, I could quite easily see a 1-1 Froslass, 1 Scoop Up Net mini package going into the deck just for that option where you're allowed to then play a supporter that isn't Melony the following turn, but you're still representing that Max Lance and still representing that question mark for the opponent. So I'm excited to see that Froslass. It could even see play, like I said, in a Altaria Suicune approach, where you can Altaria a Cheryl to the top, then you can play that Cheryl Frost over attach straight after. So yeah, I think Froslass does have more potential, especially going forward in the post-rotation meta, to be a potential like 2-3 star style card, where I still don't expect it to be an Ice Rider, to be honest with you, but it could easily be that 1/1 plus Scoop Up Net package where it gets that little bit of extra value to make you have some more flexible plays available. And I think Altaria leans into that flexibility quite nicely, so something to bear in mind for sure. Inteleon, here we go. So, just to give you context, before quick shooting was a thing, the Shady Dealing package wasn't seeing any play, like in any deck. It was being bullied out by Jirachi and Cincino the entire time. But it turned out that these 2 extra damage pings was the difference in not just the water decks that I had right here. I thought Ice Rider was pretty much nailed on to be playing this sort of engine, at least, you know, out the gate. It was definitely a way that we all touted, but I didn't quite foresee how big of an impact it was going to have on Urshifu specifically. And I think going forward, it's going to have, you know, it's going to dominate post rotation as an engine, to be honest. We basically have exactly this option or the Cincino option. And I think that also boils down to the search options that we have post-rotation, how important it is to play level ball just to get Pokemon on the board. So yeah, free damage is free damage, and we still need to respect it as that. So it does have to go all the way up to that 5-star where Urshifu, you know, ran the flagpole with this, and Ice Rider also played this in Chilling Reign format, and I think you can make an argument for a ton of Inteleon engines post-rotation, for a ton of these VMAXs, just for extra flexibility with your damage here and there, whilst also having the consistency pieces along the way. So yeah, it's going to be at the forefront of the meta, I think, going forward. So really, really insane card. And I'm happy to see that Feather Arrow actually got that spiritual reprint that was good enough. I remember when we had conversations like Volcarona GX, for example, where we thought it was the second coming of Feather Arrow, and then it flopped. And that kind of then twisted my arm thinking this was going to be ending up too slow and not getting enough value. But we actually can extend the game long enough to get, you know, 2, 3, 4 quick shootings throughout the game. And that's just so much free damage that you can't pass it up, especially when Shady Dealings gets you into your consistency in the opening stages anyway. Banette is terrible. Cresselia wasn't that 4-star card. I think overall it got beaten by Horror House and how important that was in the opening stages. Just buying a turn was often better than just flooding your board of energies. But I think going into post-rotation, it doesn't have to compete with Horror House anymore. So we'll drop it down right now to like a 2-star for the Chilling Reign format. But for post-rotation, I think it will more than likely be a one-of that you do see in Shadow Rider. It's quite bad going into some decks that can boss on turn 2 and KO your Shadow Rider. So you're not going to Crescent Glow every single game going second, even if you have the option and increase our switch outs and whatnot to actually search this Cress. But I think against some lower pressure decks that aren't able to, you know, hit 220 turn 2 very easily, onto the bench Pokemon, things like Rayquaza, they can hit that sort of damage, but they are often having to do it into the active position. These sorts of things is more so what I'm meaning here, where you can just give them a freebie 1 prizer and then you've powered up energies on the bench. I think that could be relatively important and at least force that boss's orders. So I think it's likely to be a one-of post-row, so we can keep it at that, you know, potential onward-looking 4-star potential option. Gardevoir Gallade, we gave the benefit of the doubt just because of water dupes. But yeah, this was very, very bad. And I think going forward, it won't change too much, even though it still has some delicious type coverage and a lot of draw inbuilt here. We don't have Mew anymore. And I think that's already enough to say no to a lot of one-prize decks. So now that ADP is gone, you can wave goodbye to that, but I think we're still quite bad against Urshifu, which is a shame. Malamar was more than a 1-star meme, actually. It was probably, let me see where it rated, actually, on the overall decks. I think it was actually a top 20 deck. No, it wasn't. Okay, it was actually quite bad. Okay, that's fine. Where are we? Okay, yeah, it wasn't a very, very good deck. So I'm not sweating too much about it now. It was actually quite bad. How harsh do I want to be on my own rating here? I mean, ultimately, it was like quite a bad deck, but it did see experimentation, so we can give it 2-star for that. We can give it the recognition that people played it. It was a deck. We had to know what it did, that sort of thing. And post rotation, we lose Oricorio, so I am seeing it hard to come back from that sort of thing. We also lose our 60 hit point Dark Inkay, which makes us much more vulnerable to Astral Barrage turn 2. So yeah, I think that's also very, very bad for you. So it can stay at that 2-star, like potential Mimi 1-prize deck if you really want to. Yeah, sorry, just had to look at the stats there. Slurpuff, we only mentioned on the slide as a spiritual successor for post-rotation, and that is still the case, but I don't think it's good enough. Lycanroc is terrible. Persimmon was that 5-star for exactly Urshifu as exactly that one of, as pretty much expected, and I think that will continue going forward. Can't even say it. Runerigus was terrible. Weezing was terrible. Quillfish wasn't worth the experimentation. Could continue to not be worth the experimentation. Yeah, probably still not. Seviper, I was a dreamer. The 2 type coverages of Dark and Fighting didn't stitch this deck together well enough, because you still were jumping through too many hoops most of the time with an awkward draw engine. So down to the 1-star probably. I feel like if you're adding in Dark to a single strike deck now, you'll just play Umbreon going forward. Spiritomb was correctly that 1-star, and this is just evaluating correctly that Shadow Rider already beat Mad Party, so there's no point in having a Mad Party tech when the new best deck in the game already like auto won. So yeah. Castform was that 1-star. Greedent, yeah, forgot that card even existed. And Kecleon was a fun meme for sure. Zangoose also very bad. So yeah, in summary, for the 1 prizes, very, very much undersold the Inteleon. This is one of those hard things though, where you look back and you say, how could they have possibly rated this 3-star? But at the time, Shady Dealings was completely being beaten out by Make Do and Stellar Wish. So the game basically just changed on its head in Chilling Reign, like in a massive way. The main draw engine changed, from what we'd seen previously, where quick shooting was a big enough payoff. Outside of that, pretty much every card was bad, except for the one of Persimmon. So, yeah, not much to say on the Chilling Reign 1 prizer front. Look out for Froslass. Cress probably becomes a more valid card. And Inteleon continues to like dominate, and I think really becomes a widespread engine in a lot of decks. So yeah, let me know your thoughts overall on the Chilling Reign meta, and let me know what decks you were running in this format. What did you think were the best decks in the game, and what do you think will continue to dominate post rotation? Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you did enjoy, but we'll be back to some deck analysis tomorrow. So cheers.